The start of my interest in this is really two train journeys which I took back in March. One was in England, and I needed to go down from London to Taunton for the day on business. And the second one was from Beijing to Shanghai. I needed to go. We decided rather than fly, we'd take the high-speed train. Now, those of you who are English will know possibly what it's like to travel down from London to Taunton on the train. So you start off in the city and it's built up for quite a long time, and then the time comes when you are out in the country, and suddenly it's green, and there's lots of fields and quite a lot of trees, and it's quite nice, it's quite pretty. Doesn't seem to be that much going on. One or two fields have things growing in them. There's one or two horses there, maybe a field of cows. It's all sort of rather nice, but rather quiet and rather peaceful. And that's what I call the countryside. And it's quite pleasant to spend a day looking out of the window there. And then, so when I was about to make this journey from Beijing, I was quite looking forward to seeing what the Chinese countryside was like, because I've now visited China a few times, but only into the centre of some rather large and busy cities. Beijing is quite a big city. You have to drive for over an hour before you get to the station, and then similarly you go through the edge of the city and you get to the end of the urban area. But I was struck that it's rather different. It's quite functional. The land is very fully used. You see very little waste land. It's generally carved up in rectangles, and even it was March, it's very hardly finished freezing there. There are things in the fields, there are trees growing, and there are people there, individuals, small groups, doing things in the fields, driving along their little motorbikes. I think that made a big impression. What struck me was that, I don't know if I've conveyed it, there's something fundamentally different in the relation between the land and the people in China than that there is in England. And that just sort of sat there, and then a couple of weeks later I happened to be in the library at Waterperry House, which is the property that the school has in Oxfordshire. And I was sitting in the library and I was bemoaning the fact that I'd stopped looking at books. I spend all my time now on the internet getting information, and those days of browsing and coming across a really interesting book had gone. And just as I was thinking this, my eye moved to the books in the bookshelf there, and there was this book called, it was actually a PhD thesis sitting amongst the other books by a chap called Han Lang Huang, called The Land Tax in China. And Han Lang had written this at Princeton University in 1918. And for this is shortly after the time of the Chinese Revolution. I think he is Chinese, and he was obviously looking into that subject. So I returned to my love of browsing and picked this book up and opened it up. And as I started to read, it was one of those moments when one's sort of perception of the way the world works changes. Because I suppose the impression that I have quite a long time about the subject of land value taxation is that it's a good idea, it's a brilliant idea, and if it was put in place it would change the world. But it's always been a sort of what if only. Whereas according to Han Lang, he said, well, the situation in China is for the past 4,000 years, taxing the land has been, if not the principal, one of the main sources of public revenue, almost continuously. So, what is land value taxation? Well, if you take the second biggest country in the world, second biggest economy, with the biggest population, one of the biggest, most significant civilizations in the world, particularly one with the longest continuous existence, taxing the land has been the norm for public revenue. It's the way to do it. It's the obvious way for an intelligent civilization to collect public revenue. And that, I felt, started to answer my question as to why the relationship between man and the land is so very different in that part of the world to what it is in Western Europe. And it goes back to can be found in a long history of the way that relationship has been established. So I went on to look more carefully at Han Lang's thesis, and just to have a look at the way the land has been taxed in China, particularly with a view to seeing, well, what lessons can be drawn. And so we're looking at this now not theoretically as a what if, but as a lessons from history. So if you're happy to share this with me now, I'd like to go, I've already used up 15 minutes of the time, in the next 15 minutes to go through 4,000 years of Chinese history to look at the way they've dealt with collecting public revenue from the land. Okay? I might have to start speaking quicker and quicker as I get later. So just to give us a reference point, I think the simplest way to get some anchors is with Chinese history is in terms of the dynasties. So if we just briefly go through this, like with many other civilizations, if you go back in history, it sort of fades into mythology. So we'll take up our story with the Xia dynasty, just over 2000 BC. That moves into the Shang dynasty. After that, the Zhou dynasty, that corresponds to the West to ancient Greece, really. This is the time of Confucius and Lao Tzu, and really the putting together of Chinese civilization in terms of culture and the legal system and so on. After that is the very brief but significant Qin dynasty. That's the word Qin, from which we get the word China. And that was when the system moved from a sort of feudal system to the first emperor and the central control. Qin is the man who built the Great Wall. This is all sort of simplification. And the man who had the terracotta warriors built for him to take away to wherever he went when he passed on from the end of this life. Qin, it was a rather autocratic regime. Building the Great Wall and terracotta warriors is certainly not austerity politics. There was quite a lot of public revenue, and his regime was not long-lived. He was shortly overthrown. That was followed by the Han dynasty. There are gaps between the dynasties where there's descent into chaos and civil war. We move on then. The next significant dynasty is the Tang dynasty. And the Song dynasty, which was a time of really considerable prosperity and culture in China. Then the Mongol hordes moved in. It was a fairly short-lived Yuan dynasty with Kublai Khan. The Chinese came back with the Ming dynasty, as in Ming vase, and then the last dynasty was when the Manchus came in from the north for the Qing dynasty, which takes us up to the revolution in 1910. I think when I started looking at this, to do China justice, it really needs 3 talks. It needs this talk, a second one looking at the developments in the 20th century, Sun Yat-sen and Chiang Kai-shek and the move to Taiwan, and then a third talk looking at the way things are today, but that's for another time and another person. Okay, so let's move on and look at how things happen in the Xi dynasty. This was set up, the first emperor was Yu the Great. Just before that time had been a great flood, and Yu had been the administrator who was responsible for recovering the land from the waters, and he moved on to actually become the emperor. Hang on. And one of the significant things that he did, presumably land was in short supply after the flood, was to distribute the land. There was no sense of private ownership at the land at the time. The land was the common, held in common, not really owned by anyone. So the arrangement was that at the age of 20, you were given a piece of land. 50 mao is that's their unit of area. I think that's about 10 acres. And then you used it until you were 60, and then you gave it back. So the land was distributed in terms of use. The system wasn't really tax, it was a sort of gist system that because the emperor was looking after you, you gave him in tribute 10% of your product, roughly. That's kung fa, or tribute. This would be as 10% of the produce. This is not a monetary taxation. So what's our first lesson? Is to recognise that ultimately, or from China, the land belongs to the people. Yeah. If we move on, the next dynasty, the Shang dynasty, that system of tribute was refined. This is the system of Xing Qian, which means 9 fields. It seemed that the 10% tribute ran down because it became fixed quotas rather than just a proportion of the produce. So when there was a poor harvest, it put onerous pressure on the farmers. So this system, it possibly goes back much further, but it's at this time that it's actually recorded. So what happens is that 8 families are organised together. Each of those families has in their square is their 50 mao of land, but that's set up into an arrangement of 9 squares. So each family has a square of its own for its own produce. The 9th square, the one in the middle, the top left-hand corner is the land for where they live, and the remaining part, you see what's coming? Is what they give as their tribute. So that, if you like, is the tax. So each farms his own, but there is an additional portion which goes as public revenue. And if you see that, work out, that is rough, because the living quarters are there, then that comes out as roughly 10% of the total produce of the land goes as government revenue. But no, I think it's brilliant, this. We're looking for economics for conscious evolution. The sense is nobody is giving up their own private crops. They're welcome to keep what they grow, but there's an additional portion which collectively they have to contribute. And that seems to me a rather brilliant system. So our second lesson, I suggest, is the best method of public revenue is when you don't appropriate what people regard as their own private property, or the fruits of their own labour. Then move on to the Zhou dynasty, which followed. That system continued. That's Confucius there, looking over us in his wisdom, but underwent some refinement. So the key point, again, is, and this is the thing, it's one of the main lessons, that land is allocated for use. And in fact, there were severe penalties if you did not use the land that was allocated. You had to pay 3 or 4 times much more tax or penalties than those who were simply using it. The other refinement that was made was that the amount of land allocated depended on the fertility. Because obviously if everyone is getting the same area, some are going to get better land than others. So what happened was, if you had the most fertile land, you got like 50 mao, 1 unit. If it was less fertile, so you could only grow crops every 2 years, you got twice as much. If it's the least fertile, you got 3 times as much. But public revenue was essentially still the 9 field system, and that had moved on from a sense of it initially being gift, now as a sense of a universal obligation, or shay. I would say it's not the only way of collecting revenue, and in this system there would also be a requirement to make a contribution to military service, both in supplying equipment, chariots and so on, and people. Now, this was at the time a feudal system, so there were overlords. The produce of the central province went to the emperor. The other produce went to the various, there's a sort of hierarchy of barons and dukes, barons, earls. They got most of the rest of the produce, but passed a portion on to the emperor. The interesting thing was, the further you were up in the hierarchy, the more you had to pay. So if you were a duke, the biggest land, it's not land owning, but biggest area that you covered, you had to pay half. If you were a smaller earl, something like a third. If you were a smaller baron, you paid a smaller proportion. So where did it all go wrong? Should we move on to the next one? Yeah, the Qin dynasty. So at this time there were a large number of provinces which were slowly consolidating. You see that, maybe not, but the Qin province is the big green one on the west, which is characterised by having a large area but a small population. And just to the east of that, I think it's part of the, just where the purple square is, was the Jin province, which was small in area but high in population. And the Qin ruler at the time had the brilliant idea that to increase his strength, he would encourage people to migrate from the heavily populated province to his lightly populated one. And the easiest way to do that, he thought, was to simply invite them in to own the land. So he abandoned the 9 field system and allowed people to come in and take land and use it. So we got a movement towards privately owned property, which could be held and bought and sold. With the wars that ensued at the end of the Zhou dynasty, the Qin emperor prevailed, and he took over the whole of China and therefore imposed his system on the rest of China. So we moved down, David, into the Qin dynasty. As you say, this is the chap who produced built the Great Wall and the terracotta warriors, and established a centralised autocratic Chinese empire. But the strain on the population was such that they rose up in opposition. There was a rebellion, and we moved into the Han dynasty. But the idea of the system of private property remained. And what are the effects of that? Well, this is a quote from the time, phrase, "The rich own thousands of mo, whilst the poor have not enough land for an all to stand on." And part of the reason for that concentration was the high taxes meant that the small landowners couldn't afford to pay, or in order to pay they had to sell up, and they became tenants. So we moved us to a system of landlords and tenants typically paying half of their produce to the landowner. There were moves to go back to the old system, but the trouble is, once you've got powerful landowners, they've got power, and they're going to influence the government, and they're going to influence the economists in terms of their policy. So this is how they persuaded the economists at the time to look at the land question. The 2 sources of production are labour and land, and in order that all land capable of producing crops might be cultivated, and all hands engaged in agriculture, taxes on land should be abolished. Well, that's reasonable, isn't it? You want to get the country to work, you want to get stuff produced. The last thing you want to be doing is taxing land. And that sort of pressure was successful. So at this time, the taxes on land were quite low, and down to about 1/30 of the produce. So other taxes, particularly poll taxes, taxes on individuals, were higher and heavier. and a movement towards paying tax in cash now rather than in produce. So what's the lesson to learn from this? Well, this is the lesson I suggest, that you'll never have an effective land tax when there is unrestrained private ownership in land, because that will give you a concentration of power in the landowners. The landowners will affect the government, and the last thing they'll have the government do is put a tax on land. You agree?
Yes.
So where do we go next? Next thing that happened was a certain degree of internal strife and civil war. And of course, one of the things that does is it kills off the landowners, and it lays the land destitute, but it does sort of provide a vacuum for reform. So what happens when stability was restored in the Tang dynasty was that there was a move was put back in place to restore the distribution of land. So order was restored and distribution of land re-established. So the next lesson of history is that it is possible to move back from unrestrained private ownership to government allocation of land. Historically, that's typically done by warfare. Whether it can be done by a peaceful method, we'll let the future decide. Although there was equal distribution of land, the initial way that the taxes were rendered was on the assumption that the reality was that everyone had an equal portion. So the taxes tend to be levied equal amounts on equal people. But in fact, the actual situation was that the situation with land was much more fluid. Some people had little land, some people had a lot of land. And that led to some strife. However, in 780, there were significant tax reforms by the administrator Yang Yen, who moved the system of tax back away from people and individuals back onto the amount of land that was possessed. The system was called the Liang Shi, which means the summer and autumn levy, because it was levied twice, first in the summer in produce and then in the autumn in typically in copper coinage. And this time was a time of great prosperity and commercial development for China. We move on from the Tang to the Song dynasty. I should say that system was really established and set the precedent for the next 1,000 years. We had the basis of a tax on land in terms of its productivity. There were certain developments. The Song dynasty, it's recorded, actually is a bit more sophisticated. You can put the next button there. So the sources were rent from public land. We had effectively our mixture. It wasn't all public land, some public, some private. But the public land was paying rents, the farm were paying rents, there were urban rents, also poll tax and other taxes related to commercial activity. So we're not saying that this is a single tax for 4,000 years, but land tax, significant part of public revenue. After that, significant events historically, not actually big changes in the system of public revenue. So the Mongols came in, particularly with Kublai Khan, but there was a combination of being suitably intelligent and impressed with the Chinese civilization that they adapted to what was actually there rather than imposing their own culture. So on the ground, in a sense, is not that much significant happened. So the Mongols were there for roughly a century, and then a return to the Chinese rule with the Ming dynasty. Sorry, looking at the clock and speeding up. Ming dynasty, probably, this is Ming vase, this is with the capital now in Beijing. Construction of the hidden city, the Palace of Heaven, another really high point in Chinese culture. I think there's a couple of pictures just to show the extent of the cultivation. Fortunately, the Forbidden City now not so forbidden, big tourist attraction, but giving a sense of the of cultivation. At the beginning of the Ming dynasty, was a very effective administration. A long time was spent, years, collecting a tax roll and monitoring the land and revaluing and so on. And public revenues was very effective, and prosperity was there. But as in many cases, over time, this tended to, it sort of declined. The tax roll was not renewed, it became obsolete, additional revenues came in, and the whole thing sort of declined. And in due course, I suppose this is an aspect of, we talk about conscious evolution. In practice history, we essentially see a cyclical movement where new impulse comes in, there's a rise in civilization, we have effective administration, and then it almost seems inevitably it runs down. So at the end of the, just go back, the end of the Manchu, right, so you're jumping ahead. Things will run down. There was a peasant revolution, and the Manchurians, who had been coalescing power in the north, managed to move in and take over. But generally, again, adapting to what was there. There was an interesting shift in land ownership, which they called the enclosure. It's different to our enclosures. What it consisted of was them taking over the land of the Ming aristocrats and giving it out to the Manchu warriors. But again, it was small portions, and typically in return for not a paid rent, but for military service. So that a closure at that act was actually a move from large-scale ownership to this emphasis on allocation of land for use, emphasis on putting the land to good use, to increase productivity, increase agricultural productivity, and increase the population. Now, the interesting thing about the Manchus is initially it started off so well, but in the reign of the Emperor Kangxi, he felt it was going so well, he was embarrassed. The coffers were so full of produce that there was not room for any more. So he did an interesting thing, which is called the final settlement. And he said that at the time the taxes were particularly the land tax and the poll tax, and he said, from now on there will be no changes, i.e. in the number of people who we collect the poll tax from, or in the value of the land, the basis of the valuation from which we collect the produce of the land. So from 1713, right, for the next 200 years, the official assessment of values was fixed. You don't agree that that's a good idea? One positive effect of that is that it tended to coalesce the poll tax and the land tax and the other taxes into a single tax. But because the thing was fixed, it in a way fairly effectively started to fall apart. In a way, the history of the Manchu dynasty, it's the final dynasty, and particularly in the latter half of the 19th century, various things came together, both natural, man-made disasters that the dynasty declined. But a couple, just our lessons then. This is a lesson which was there to be learned big time, that if you want an effective land tax, it does need regular updating of land values. And if you set your values in stone for all time, you're asking for trouble. Another two lessons from the Manchus, that's a picture of the magistrate's yamen, is at its best the system of administration was very effective. If in the good times, the tax administrator would come along, evaluate the land, and fill out the tax assessment in quadruplet, 4 times. So he kept one. I'm going to stop very shortly. The magistrate kept one, and the farmer kept 2. He found out how much needed to pay, But what they made sure it didn't happen, it was never handed over to the tax collector. It was put in a box in front of the magistrate's yaman and only opened in his presence. And the idea there is to have an open and transparent and effective administrative system. And that's, no, jumping ahead, go back a bit, that was 8. Why it didn't work effectively, and one of the reasons it fell into disrepute, is provision was never made to fully finance and pay for the administration. So they were always underfinanced and underpaid. So always looking means for extracting part of the revenue for their own upkeep. So lesson 9 is that if that administration, it needs to be effective, but you do have to have a means of paying for it. So to summarise, we do have, if we look to the east, a 4,000-year history of collecting public revenue from the land, and there are many significant lessons to draw on. Time's coming to an end, so I won't go through them all again, but maybe to add to that, to finish with a lesson 10, is let us learn the lessons of history.